Hi, welcome everyone to today's webinar. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're dialing in from, as we have lots of people that have literally signed up for the webinar from all over the world. So welcome to the webinar celebrating Black History Month in the UK. I'm Ratika. I'm excited to be here as the Director of UK Operations for the Cultural Intelligence Centre. As the Cultural Intelligence Centre's first subsidiary employee, I oversee everything for our UK operations, so right from development to delivery and everything else in between. Yeah, and I'm really happy to be here in that capacity hosting this webinar. I'm going to give the opportunity to our two very illustrious panelists on this webinar today, two trailblazing, powerful Black women that I'm honored to share the stage with. So over to you, Dr. Sandra Upton, to kick it off. And then as soon as you've done, Jennifer, I would hand the stage over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ratika, and I'm so excited to be a part of this really important conversation today. As Ratika said, I am Sandra Upton, founder and Chief Diversity Officer with the Upton Consulting Group. That transition is very recent. I formerly was the VP of Global Diversity Practice with the Cultural Intelligence Center for the last year and worked for the center for close to 7 years. So excited to be here to talk about Black history, to talk about what it means to be Black, and how all of this important conversation ties to cultural intelligence. So glad to be here.
Oh, and I'm so excited to be here as well, Ratika, and it's always such a pleasure to share a stage with Sandra. My name is Jennifer Izeko. I am the founder and leader of Above Difference Limited. We work at developing culturally intelligent and inclusively led organizations in the public sector across the UK. And I've been doing that, I think I set it up in about 2017, so it feels like quite a while now. We're also very pleased to be a strategic partner of the Cultural Intelligence Centre, and that's a really important relationship we have. So yeah, Black History Month, just a really great opportunity to be part of many conversations going on and getting to share the stage with Ratika and Sandra today. Yeah, really exciting, really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Jennifer. Right, so what are we really going to cover in the next hour? I'm just going to take you through some quick webinar notes. And before I do that, really just take you through what we're going to cover in the hour. I'm going to, after the webinar notes, take you, go through the definition of CQ really and what the CQ framework is about. Then the stage is ours to really just going into having a conversation in light of Black History Month, as we have two amazing Black women on the stage, one from the UK and one from the US, and it's about having a conversation about this moment. And then we're going to obviously open it up to questions from the audience, which is also my favorite part, because we always get amazing questions that leads to great conversations. So for the basics, you are automatically muted and your cameras are off. Please feel free to add any comments in the chat. Send us any questions via the Q&A tab, and we will try to answer as many as possible. If we cannot answer them, we will try and come back to you with an email response. For those of you who want to come back and watch this webinar again, or feel that you might want to share it with others, then it is being recorded and will be available to share or view through our website. So what is cultural intelligence? Cultural intelligence is the capability to function and work effectively in culturally diverse situations. It is a skill, and as we develop that skill, it allows us to work and relate effectively in situations and with people that are different from us. In 2016, Deloitte released a report which identified the 6 signature traits of an inclusive leader. The 6 C's really, which are courage, cognizance, curiosity, commitment, collaboration, and cultural intelligence. We could not agree more that CQ is an important trait that leaders need to have. But even if we look at the 5 other traits, then you need CQ to be able to capture them really. CQ is that foundation to inclusive leadership. And CQ is based on the framework. These capabilities are based on the framework, as you can see on the screen. And I'm going to kick off with CQ Drive. So CQ Drive is how you feel about being in a situation that is different from what you're used to. CQ Drive predicts your capability to persevere in unfamiliar context. It's your motivation and how confident or not you feel in those situations. Moving on to CQ Knowledge, it is what you understand about the cultures you're involved with. It's what you do to learn more about the situation, any situation that is not familiar to you. It is about deeply understanding your own biases, your privileges, and building that knowledge to tackle situations that are different or unfamiliar to you. Moving on to CQ Strategy. CQ Strategy is the planning part. It is the degree to which you accurately anticipate and make sense of what is going on. And last but not the least, CQ Action. This one is about what you actually do. It is the degree to which you appropriately adapt while not over adapting or compromising yourself or the organization you're representing. So really, I mean, as we talk about for the next hour or so, as we discuss Black history and have this conversation in this moment, a lot of reference will be made to the CQ framework, which hopefully I've been able to provide some background on. Over to the questions, really, to our panelists now. So Dr. Sandra Upton, I would love to know, what does being Black really mean?
Yes, that's a deep question, and there are a lot of different ways to think about that, but I sort of want to come at it from sort of two sides. And first, I want to just share a very quick story. A few years back, I had gone to an event that was hosted by my colleague and dear friend, Dr. David Livermore. He's given me permission to share this story, and I've told it a number of times. But while at that event, it was at his home, my husband and I sat down at a table, and there was a woman that sat next to us, happened to be an older Caucasian woman or Euro-American woman. And she asked, we started a conversation, and she asked how I knew Dave. And my husband interjected and proceeded to tell her that I worked with Dave. And she said, "Oh, so are you his scheduler?" And, you know, it was that moment where it was just such a reminder that now her reason for asking that question could have come from a couple of different places, but the assumption that I made was that it was likely tied to perhaps my race and gender. But it was a reminder for me in that moment as a Black woman in America that those stereotypes and assumptions and biases are still there, regardless of my position at that time as an executive with the organization, right? So that experience is not one that is unfamiliar to me and many other Blacks in America. So that sort of gives a little snippet into what it means to be Black. And I think about a comment that columnist, and I want to look at this, so I want to quote him correctly, but columnist Jonathan Capehart with the Washington Post, he made a statement and said, "There's no one way to be Black in America, but there is one way we live while being Black in America." Right. And so there's this, the one side of the story or the coin is this ugly history of racism and of slavery in America, and the fact that the implications of that significant event still has huge implications for us today. So as a Black person in America, we're still navigating through that, right? We've made some progress, but there's still quite a bit more progress to be made. There are still significant disparities in just about every industry or area that you want to look at, whether that's healthcare, whether that's education, you know, whether that's the criminal justice system. So what it means to be Black in America is that, again, we are very diverse. We are, not a monolithic culture, but the way we live and have to navigate through life in America, there are some common themes and patterns there. I don't know if you're familiar with this in the UK, and we're going to talk later, I know, about some of the similarities and differences, but many, if not all, Black families in America, for example, are very familiar with what we call the talk. right? And the talk is this
Mm.
conversation that you have with your children, and in particular, your African-American male children, which we have a son who's 22 years old, but that talk is all about teaching him how to navigate, right, through the day as a young man of color. You know, what happens when you get stopped by a police officer? You know, when you're walking down the street, you don't wear a hoodie, don't put it on your head, because of, again, of how African Americans or Blacks are perceived, and the biases towards Blacks. So that's sort of the ugly side of what it's like. And with that comes, again, you know, frustration, fatigue, trauma. And so there's that navigating all the time. The other side of the coin is this, or the spectrum, is this tremendous sense of pride, given all of what Blacks have had to endure here in America. The resilience and persistence, and the fact that we are still here and standing strong is something that many of us celebrate. And again, I'm very proud of, and use it as a way to propel the work that we continue to strive to do, to not only support and enable the African American or Black community, but also, you know, create a win-win for all of us.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Sandra. Gosh, it's so powerful and heartbreaking at the same time, really, that, you know, the talk, and, you know, there's a comment from the audience by Richard that's, you know, very poignant. Surely it's also dealing with more than just difference. It is dealing with systemic oppression and
Absolutely.
privilege of certain groups. And that really is the fact of the matter, unfortunately. So thank you for your you know, what Black means to you, Sandra. Jennifer, love to hear what Black means to you as a woman of color and from a UK perspective.
Thank you. And Sandra, that was just such a deep answer. And I loved that emphasis on that the writer talks about on that shared experience. And I think that's a really powerful thing across the world, not just in the US. But I was thinking about this question, Ritika, and I thought that in many ways, from a personal perspective, it's meant different things to me in my life. So as a child, I was born in the UK, and I was one of those children, there are many of us, who were given out to foster parents, white foster parents. Because our parents were African, they were working, and that was one of the things they did. And so at that time, so from probably a very young age to being about 7, when I was in the UK living with white families, being Black to me meant always being different. It meant being the one who always stood out. It meant the questions about the color of my skin and whether it came off and if I got scrubbed and all sorts of things like that, and a diverse a range of experiences, but always recognizing that I was different from the people who were around me. And I think as a Black person, that's a feeling that, you know, I've recognized in different guises as I've gone through my life and as I've grown older, whether it's been being in boardrooms or being in certain situations where I am the different one. So that's been a big emphasis of that. But then I went back to Nigeria and spent most of my teenage years and my university years in Nigeria. And I thought today, when I was thinking of this question, that I never really thought then a lot about being Black, because actually I was surrounded by people who looked like me. We were in a place where we're in the majority, and yes, things weren't always brilliant in terms of who was doing what, and there were internal divisions, but it wasn't a conversation I had with myself or other people very often. And then I came back to the UK, and the difference, the being Black and being different, became very much a part of who I was. And many of the things that Sandra talked about already, you know, the discrimination, the shared experiences. But something I reflected on quite a lot today, and I think in many ways that says a lot to me about what it means being Black, is that thing that happens, and I don't know if I'm alone in this. Often when you are somewhere, you might be in a country where you're the only one, or you know, in a place where you're the only one, and then you see another Black person, and there's almost a kind of silent nod that happens, or a kind of silent look that you exchange between each other. And I wondered, and for some reason that struck me as I thought about this question. I thought, that's not so much about, it's about our past history, but obviously we have so many diverse histories, but it's also about that shared lived experience. It's about wherever you go, there's something in that look that goes, I know your walk. we're there, you know, we know what that it feels like to be Black. And I think there's so much in that look that's about shared lived experiences, shared history, a shared understanding of how we're seen by other people, a shared understanding of the privilege, and a shared understanding of all the things. And in that look, there's something that really defines, you know, yeah, you're Black, I'm Black, we get it. And that I think is it encompasses a whole lot. But just to finish, I also was talking to my daughter about this, and I think being Black is also about a generation. You know, in the UK, there are first, second generation young Black people, and their experience and how they articulate their Blackness, you know, is very different as well from the other generations. So I think this is such a multifaceted answer, but yeah, I think in the look, there's something that says, yeah, this is what it means to be Black.
Ritika, I know you've got to go to the next question, but just an interesting story as Jennifer was talking, I resonate 100% with that shared experience of when, regardless of where you are in the world. But a few years back when I was visiting Nigeria, and I had gone there with a couple of my white colleagues from the US, and very good relationships, so we could be, you know, have fun with each other. And I remember joking with them and saying, you know, and it was my first trip to Nigeria. And I remember saying, so just so you all know, when we get there, you know, I may act like I don't even know you. I'm going to be so excited to be home, and just sort of tease them about that. But I remember one evening we had dinner, and we were engaged with several local folks in Lagos, and then we had gone over to Abuja, and we were sitting at a table, and I was looking forward to just really mingling with the folks that were living there. And my two colleagues, who happened to be white men, one sat on one side of me and one sat on the other side of me. And I'm like, white men, I can't get rid of you. You're everywhere. I'm in Africa. Give me space. I'm trying to be with my people, and here you are. And they laughed, and we kind of joked about it. But really, the point behind that was, again, just this hunger and desire that, especially going back, you know, to the motherland, so to speak, there is something very special about that. And again, you could be anywhere in the world, whether it's in Africa, Singapore, anywhere, and you see a person of African descent, and there is, in most cases, this immediate connection. You don't know anything about them, but we see each other, and that's very powerful.
Gosh, thank you for that, Sandra. That was an amazing, yeah, well, funny but not so funny story. But yeah, I know your walk, right? I mean, gosh, that's just, yeah, it's so powerful. Thank you for sharing that. Well, while we're on sharing stories and not looking at time as we I'm just going to, so when I moved to Canada, my first Black friend, right? So and she became a friend, genuinely a friend. So we're going for a walk for lunch, and I'm looking at her and going, well, I don't even see color. Now we know, working in DEI and whatever, that of course that is such an important part. This is about acknowledging the identity of the people we are with, and that's when I got my first lesson. And there's me, brown girl, right, going, I don't see color. Like, what's right? So it's just, yeah, it's just acknowledging those identities, and even though everybody is so similar, they're also so different. Talking about similar and different. So, you know, really, where Jennifer, where do you see differences and, in fact, similarities in your lived experience and history from a UK perspective?
Well, that's an interesting one, Ritika, and really great question, and one that I constantly revisit in my mind all the time. So my parents came to the UK in probably about 1962, post independence in Nigeria. My mom was a nurse, she joined the NHS. My dad was studying to be an accountant. And there's a particular history around, you know, people who came from the African colonies and what their expectations were and what their history had been. And as you'll be aware, when it comes to the Windrush, HSS Windrush arrived, Empire Windrush arrived in 1948 and brought many citizens from the Caribbean islands. And so what I think has been really interesting about our experiences in the UK is that we have this mixture of histories and backgrounds, many tied to colonialism, many tied to our experiences, our parents' experiences of arriving in the UK and why they arrived, how they arrived. For many Africans, there was that expectation, which indeed my parents had, that they would come to the UK, they would get their qualifications, and then they'd go back to this exciting new country that was, suddenly independent, was on the verge of great things. And that's what a lot of African parents did. Of course, for those families who arrived on the Windrush and arrived from the Caribbean, there was that intention to stay and to work, and that was what was encouraged, and that has its own history. And then, of course, before any of those things, there were those people from the Caribbean, from the Commonwealth, who'd arrived during the Second World War, who were soldiers in the Second World War, who'd been conscripted to serve, and they carried a history, and they had their own experiences of arriving in that time and how they were treated as GIs. And indeed, probably, I think history tells us that the 17th century was when we first had a Black population in the UK. So I think that what's interesting, I think, about the UK, and then not to talk of all the mixed heritage and what's happened since then, is there's this myriad of histories of people. And sometimes I think the biggest mistake that is made is almost the sense that, BAME or BME kind of becomes an umbrella under which of those things almost lose their own identity. And so going back to what you said about being Black, I think it's important that within for me, within the phrase of being Black, I honor and celebrate the different histories that are there. And so, for instance, often when we're talking about Windrush, I often don't feel as identified with the Windrush agenda because my parents were Nigerian, didn't come on Windrush, but did come on a ship, and it was a different time. And so there's this wonderful different history of people in the UK, but I think what they share is the resilience. What they share are the negative experiences of discrimination, of the things we have in terms of the race riots and all of those things. What we share is the journey of the second and third generation, our children who have come along and what they've had to cope with and are still coping with. And like Sandra talked about, the talk, the recognition that the relationship between all of those communities and the policing and the police community has not always been as positive as it could be. And there still remain a lot of problems there, and there still remains that significant distrust. And actually, when you see the statistics in terms of employment, in terms of the lack of opportunity, the inequities, health inequities, then suddenly all those barriers are often broken down because, again, people are collated together within all of that. So I think being Black in the UK means being part of sometimes a monolithic label that I don't think works for anyone. But it also means, I think, within the Black community, those precious identities and history that we have all coming together into this beautiful pot that makes us this wonderful, ever-growing, diverse, tapestry of a people who come together at that point where we share our history of resilience and our history of strength and our history of fighting against the odds to become the people, the exciting people that I think we are.
Gosh, Jennifer, yes. There's a couple of things I want to address in the powerful way you have helped us understand the differences and similarities. One is, going back to when we were talking about how Blacks are referred as African American in America, but in the UK, there's Blacks are from the Caribbean as well as they are, could be from Africa. So what's your sense on that?
Well, it's an interesting one because when, I love the fact that, Sandra, in the US, we talk about African Americans. But if you were filling in a form in the UK that was looking at your identity, you would say Black African, Black Caribbean, Black mixed, Black this. So there's a whole sort of breaking down, which in many ways is great because we are very different. And I think we need to celebrate that. But in other ways, I think there's something also beautiful about what happens in the States, that you have this African American that kind of becomes its own powerful identity of a people in itself. And so I don't know, I think that's a powerful difference, Ritika, and that is a really great question. It's a powerful difference, but it is a difference, definitely.
And I want to go to Sandra with the African American, but before I do that, you've mentioned the relationship of Black people with police. And
Yeah.
I am personally so impressed with the CQ work that you're doing with the Avon and Somerset Constabulary and the police forces in the UK. Please
Mm.
tell us a little bit more about, how that work is impacting on the ground.
Yeah, well, for me, this has been a really powerful thing, both personally and professionally, because my last formal role was as a commissioner with the Independent Police Complaints Commission, and in that role, I had oversight of serious and complex cases that were brought often against the police, and that was a role that for me was quite a contentious one in many ways, and I often say it was one in which I saw the very worst of what can happen when things go wrong. But I also saw the very best of what can happen when things go right and people and communities and policing organizations work together to make things right. And so when I stepped away from that role and set up Above Difference, one of the things I was passionate about was actually thinking about how cultural intelligence could make such a difference to that particular agenda and could begin to provide some of the hows, because I'd met a lot of well-intentioned, well-meaning people in policing who really wanted to get this right, but just struggled with knowing what it was that they needed to do differently. And I thought, listen, when I did the cultural intelligence accreditation, I thought this could make a difference. And so I happened to approach someone who at that point was the chief constable of Avon and Somerset, Andy Marsh. He's recently taken up post as the chief executive of the policing college, and asked him if he'd let me come pilot cultural intelligence in Avon and Somerset. He said yes. We did a pilot in Bristol. The results that came out of that were just phenomenal. And they committed to then rolling it out. As you probably know, Bristol has probably trained all their senior officers, most of their frontline leaders and managers. They have 4 or 5 accredited facilitators of their own. And you probably know the very wonderful Superintendent Andy Bennett, who has now technically retired, although I'm not sure he has, because he's still the chief for the specials, but also is a co-facilitator, is one of our team on Above Difference. So, for us, we've seen this make a difference between communities and policing. And I'm absolutely passionate, I think, about the role that cultural intelligence has to play in supporting organizations, supporting that bond and helping people understand each other better.
That impact on the ground, right? It's all well and good to sit across the table and talk about stuff, but when it's the community that is being affected by how those in powers behave, this is where it really matters. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. Sandra, so African American, where do you see differences and similarities from a US perspective?
Yeah, I would agree with so much of what Jennifer just said. I think, the similarities are probably pretty obvious to most of us, right? So there is that dynamic again of the role that slavery or just this idea of oppressing people, how that's played out certainly in the UK and in the US and in fact all across the world, right? This desire to control based on greed by oftentimes the dominant culture. There's that theme everywhere. But so I see that as a clear similarity. And I think, you're right. When you look at the census and how we are asked to define ourselves, our identity. And there's a lot of discussion though and debate now about what that all means and looks like, but it is generally, Black or African American. And then there's that debate about, do you want to be called African American, excuse me, or Black? And there was a recent survey done where most people said that they preferred to be called Black versus African American. So, lots of conversations around that. And then you've got the dynamic of, when you think about some of the differences, you've got the dynamic of, again, just the intersectionality of that we all have in terms of the multiple identities. So you have lots of people who are pushing back on, yes, I am Black and African American, but I'm also this, and this. And so I don't want to be locked into this box of only being one. And so the whole idea of the other category or the blended, that's a conversation as well. And then of course, even within the Black community, like I started out, there's not one way to define. We are not monolithic. We do have lots of diversity within the culture. And I also think there is that element, and this ties a little bit to what Jennifer was saying, where I do think there could be some slight similarities. People who move to the United States from Africa, right? They see their experience here and look at history here differently than those who are African American, right? So I have friends from Nigeria who maybe came here to go to college and then they've stayed. Their experience, how they view the history and the relationships differently. But I think even in that, there are still those common themes because of the color of their skin. They recognize, right, that the challenges and the discrimination and the microaggressions, those transcend whether you are born and raised here in the US or you moved here as a college student from South Africa or Nigeria. So I think those are, it's a combination of similarities and differences that I think, again, very much mirror a lot of what Jennifer was talking about.
Yeah, thank you, Sandra. And we've got someone, Gary from the audience, saying to Sandra's point, people are not monolithic and represent a spectrum of intersectionality that can lead to both areas of oppression and privilege for them simultaneously.
Absolutely.
I think that's such a great point.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your perspective, Jennifer and Sandra, on differences, similarities, and lived experiences. So how does CQ really tie? You both are so close to doing work, the CQ work on the ground, and as being Black women, what role does CQ have to play in all of this?
Yeah, so I'll kick off a response to that. I think that the framework, as you described at the beginning of this webinar, is really an outstanding and very powerful tool to do a number of things. So when we think about, change, and when we think about race, and in particular Blacks, African Americans, Black Britons, whatever we want to give that. It's at the end of the day, if we're going to work together more effectively, and if we're going to reduce, the discrimination and the bias, we've got to think about it and navigate through it both at the individual and systems level. Right. And I think the CQ framework is very powerful in helping us move along that continuum at both of those levels. And so at the individual level, it's all about helping people move beyond just being sensitive to the issues related to Blacks and being aware of the challenges, but actually move them to action and behavior change. And the framework is very powerful. Another quick story I'll share, here in the US, in the city that I live in and in the neighborhood that I live in, it is predominantly Euro-Americans who live in the neighborhood. And I often go out for walks. And as I'm walking, I see many yards that have the Black Lives Matter sign out there, right? And on the surface, it's like, yes, that's great. Thank you for being an ally. Thank you for your support. But I'm often tempted to go and knock on their door and say, I really appreciate your sign, but how are we making sure that this is not just pejorative allyship, right? Because it's wonderful, not to minimize it at all, but it's pretty low risk, right? So I want to find out, so if you really believe this, what are you actually doing? When you think about your organization, are Blacks represented in leadership? Do you challenge policies and practices at your organization to ensure that Blacks are treated equitably? Are you sponsoring any Blacks in your organization to help move them up the ladder? Do you support Black-owned businesses? What do your relationships look like? Is your doctor Black? That's where it really gets to, if you really believe Black Lives Matter, and we move from that pejorative, again, allyship to real action, which becomes sometimes uncomfortable and requires courage and also requires skill, right? So that's where the CQ framework can help that individual think about their drive and motivation and their confidence in supporting the Black movement, so to speak. And then what knowledge do they need to develop to understand what are the disparities in my organization? Where are their breakdowns? Where are the gaps? And then what strategy, what can I do? Can I be a sponsor? Can I be an ally? Can I review the policies just in my particular department and say, we're not going to do this anymore? This is clearly a barrier to our African-American employees. And then what behaviors might I need to change? So it can be very powerful at the individual level. And then the same when it comes to system change. So I think it can be really, really important, but I'm so tempted when I'm walking to just go and knock and say, can we have a conversation? I'm just curious, because the reality is that a lot of people will stick that sign in their yard and go back in their house and close their door, and they really aren't doing much else beyond that. And, that's not as helpful. So.
Yeah, that's Sandra, like just linking the CQ framework and every aspect of that to what an individual in an organization can do. It just somehow, I can't remember the name of the person, but that video where the lady had asked, anyone in the audience that wants to be treated like a Black person for a day, stand up. And no one stood up. That is so powerful. So everyone knows they don't want to have the life that Black people have, but yet, what are we doing about that? So that's where, the framework, the knowledge, the action, that's where it counts. Thank you, Sandra. Jennifer, what's your, you're doing all this work in the UK on CQ. What's your perspective and how does that link to being Black?
I think firstly, just to acknowledge and really support everything that Sandra said. And Sandra started by talking about how powerful the CQ tool is. And I would reiterate that it is, and that's why it blows me away all the time. It is just in many ways, it's so powerful in its simplicity. And that's the beautiful thing about it, that actually kind of provides a space where we can just take a step back and have these conversations in a way that perhaps we couldn't have them in other places. But I want to come at it from a slightly different perspective, not instead of what Sandra has said, but actually to add on to what Sandra has said. Because one of the things I find incredibly powerful about this is when I run sessions particularly geared at Black managers and Black leaders. And I really like doing that because one of the things that CQ allows us to do is to really explore some of that beautiful diversity within the Black culture in the UK in itself. And so I can have a room full of 20 people who would define themselves in one way, shape, or form as Black, be it shared heritage, be it from particular communities. But you kind of do a group assessment with them around their cultural values and preferences, and they're all at different sides of the scale, And so it really does shatter this assumption that actually we're this monolithic, same, wherever we come from, we're all the same, and our challenges are the same, and our walks are the same. And I think where I think it's really powerful for us as a community is remembering that we do need to recognize our own drive when it comes to how we relate with each other. We need to recognize those differences and be committed to engaging. That drive is about that motivation to find out about that history, to understand what makes us different and what makes us more powerful, even in our differences, and I think that's really important. And I love that sense of that. And it was interesting that even as I prepared for this webinar, I was looking back at some of the key moments in our history, the history of Black people in the UK, and realizing, oh my God, I didn't actually know that. I didn't know about the Bristol bus boycott in, I think it was in 1963, and how that was very much inspired by Rosa Parks. And there were things that I didn't know. And I think that is really important, that drive. And that of course ties into the knowledge. And one of the biggest challenges, I remember talking to my daughter about this, who's 25, and she constantly raises the issue of, well, but our history is just not taught. We don't know what our history is. People don't tell us about, as a young African growing up in the UK, born in the UK, she didn't learn about the kings and the queens of Africa, Mansa Musa, Suleiman, some of these amazing leaders, about the fact that actually there were vibrant civilizations in Africa long before colonialism came, long before, slavery came along, and how that has impacted even on those generations today. And so I think that CQ knowledge really allows us to open our minds to what culture really means and what the history is. And that in itself then provides us, as Sandra says, that strategy for how we engage with each other, how we work with each other, how we fight together, how we stand together. And they say a house, divided against itself will never stand. And I think that's a powerful thing. And that, follows on from the action. So I think that CQ has a huge role to play in challenging the systematic discrimination and oppression that we face as a people. But it also has a huge role to play from an internal perspective in helping us work together more effectively, to stand together to challenge that and to celebrate our diversity and our difference. And that's what I love about CQ, or one of the things.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, and great discussion going on in the audience as well around this topic. Sandra, did you want to ask me a question?
I sure did. I
didn't think I was going to get away easy.
I was so engrossed in listening to Jennifer, because it's just, I learned so much from her and you, which is why I do want to ask you a question, Ritika. We've been talking so far about, the Black experience from Black people, right? But as another woman of color, very curious to know about how you see yourself in this conversation, right? And in this space, and how you see your role as an ally, and even potentially as a sponsor for another person of color, in particular, Black people. What are your thoughts about how you see yourself in this conversation?
I've thrown myself into this question, haven't I? But yes, Sandra, you've touched on allyship quite a lot when you talked about how CQ framework ties into the Black history. And so I'm going to go back to some of those points, really. So as you mentioned, that CQ knowledge is such a big part of celebrating the significance of Black History Month, for example. Just endeavoring to learn about Black history and about the lived experiences of Black people, to me, really is the first step towards allyship. Everyone that's on a call here is an ally. So that to me is a powerful first step towards allyship. If we want to work in solidarity and in partnership with the marginalized group, the first step is to learn and grow our knowledge about them and their experiences. And that ties back to your drive and your CQ knowledge. On this call, we are all women of color, and yet I think my experience as a brown woman is so different from your experiences as Black women. Not just that, what we are hearing on this call is that both of you, your experiences as Black women couldn't be more different either. So, we share a common bond, but that doesn't mean I fully understand what your unique experiences are. And it's acknowledging that makes me an ally. So, all I can do as an ally is to listen and learn, to grow my own knowledge through actively interacting with Black people beyond the boardroom and office spaces. As an ally, I'm continually educating myself. Then I want to go a step further and say allyship spills into CQ strategy and action, because how do I show up for those I claim myself to be an ally for? So, when is it appropriate for me to speak up on their behalf and defend them, and when is it not? I don't, the savior, the savior concept, and I'd love to have a discussion on that without really, naming anything, but that. So when do you speak up and when do you not? As an ally, I never want to monopolize the emotional energy, and I want to understand my privileges fully to know when I step back and where I step in. Am I okay to accept a job from an organization that I know does not treat Black people equitably? That's down to me as an ally. Am I okay to accept that job? What do I actively do if I'm working in an organization where I can see that my Black colleagues are not being treated fairly? Do I give active and constructive feedback when I see that happening? What do I do when I witness a microaggression, as you mentioned, Sandra, towards a Black colleague? What do I do to garner support and create spaces for my Black colleagues? And so in CQ strategy, we talk about ensuring that perhaps, there's an empty chair to represent the consumer or the community who aren't represented in the meeting. That's what we're learning in CQ. And I really believe, I attended a talk recently where Meeta Malik said, nothing about us without us. So Are my Black colleagues being represented where decisions are being made that directly affect them? As an ally, I want an answer to that, and I want to do something about that. So, these are just some of the questions I ask myself as an ally, and actively use CQ and the CQ framework to build my knowledge, plan for those interactions, take the actions where it's appropriate based on my drive, my motivation, my knowledge. And that's what makes me an ally to the Black journey.
Yeah, that's great, Ritika. Everything you said, very powerful and very much can be supported and developed using the CQ framework. And, one of the areas, and I mentioned this briefly a moment ago, but I don't think gets enough conversation when we talk about all of this through the lens of equity, but the whole economic equity piece, right? So, even in terms of being an ally, what are we doing to truly create economic balance and opportunity, right? So we can talk all day long and, and again, be sensitive and aware, but then are we making sure that our businesses are giving adequate opportunities to Black businesses to be a vendor, to be a supplier? One of the things, and then just on a personal note, one of the things my husband and I have committed to everywhere we go, whenever we travel, we are very intentional about finding out what are the Black owned businesses in that area, and we're going to find some way to support them. We were, earlier this summer, we were in Napa Valley for our anniversary, wine country, and we were determined. We, did a number of things, but we've learned, we did our homework and found out there were 2 Black-owned wineries there, and we went there and we, purchased wine. But just those intentional things, that's part of a drive. If I'm really motivated and committed, that persist, because it takes work, right? We have to do the homework to develop our knowledge about, okay, what Black-owned businesses wineries are in this area. We're going to go to them. But it's that kind of stuff when we talk about system change and really closing those gaps and disparities. The economic piece is so important to the conversation. And there are things we can and should do both at the individual and systems level to close those gaps as well. And I'm not necessarily asking here. I just wanted to build on all of what you said. I think those are all phenomenal ways of thinking about the work and strategies that you've built in, and just want to challenge our audience to think about adding that economic equity piece, and think about, as you are being an ally, where are you bringing in that economic equity piece to it?
I love it. Economic equity. Absolutely love it. We've got about 10 minutes left. Please feel free, audience, to send your question in. We've got a safe space to ask those questions here in the spirit of allyship and your own journey. I've had one question really, and Jennifer, is racism in the UK more covert?
Yeah, I think so. In many ways. But, I've never lived in the US. So I'd like to put that within the context of probably seeing way too many things on YouTube that I would prefer not to see. But I think there's something about the British culture in itself that is quite, I think at a certain level and certain interactions, I remember that there have been times when I've been walking down the street and being called a name. But actually those times are so few, and they tend to be at particular times, when certain things have been happening in the culture. But compared to the amount of times that in the boardroom I have come up against a much more subtle, yet much more powerful, more damaging, more wearing kind of racism that is quite finely masked. And in many ways, I think it's the hardest kind of racism to encounter, because in many ways, other people, I could have a white colleague, and this comes back to the allyship, sitting right next to me and not recognize what has just happened, and be quite easily able to dismiss it as, oh, they were being racist? What was it? Was it? But as a Black person, you've been there, you know it, you know exactly what it is. And I think that kind of covert racism is probably the most wearing. It's a kind that comes through in recruitment procedures. It's a kind that comes through when you're being assessed for promotion, or where people are looking at your performance. It's a kind that comes through that's about isolation, or the judgments that are made about your children in school and their ability to perform. And it's that kind of subtle racism, which I'm sure happens in the States as well, but I think there's something about the culture here that allows there to be a debate. I know someone put in the chat, you know, and I'm not even going to open that particular floodgate of Meghan and Harry, but someone did mention it in the chat, but we could be here all day. But again, you know, there's a constantly an ongoing debate where people are going, yeah, but was that racist? But actually you you know, a lot of people who are Black going, oh yeah, that's racism. That is definitely, you know, someone being treated differently because of who they are. And I think what we must never underestimate is the power, the bruising power of covert discrimination and covert racism. In many ways, I think, given a choice, I would actually prefer to deal with a person who just comes out and calls me a BB right to my face, and we know where we stand, and I know how to deal with that, than the kind of covert, insidious, covert racism that, you know, really sets out to where people use power and privilege to destroy, to bring people down, to hold people back. And I think, yes, that is very prevalent in too many places of power in the UK. And it's very damaging, very, very damaging. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more, Jennifer. I think it's just emotionally taxing when you can't put a pin on it and you can't say anything, because it just festers inside, becomes a wound, and you don't even know where it came from. And the debilitating effects, short term and long term, of that, where you're questioning your own self. Did I hear that? You know, I was thinking about it recently, about, you know, having this conversation with another Black person that said, oh, all this, you know, this stuff that I've gone through because of being a Black person has made me resilient and had made my character strong. And the whole conversation that came from that, this is about being a survivor. You just want to survive, so you end up giving yourself excuses for what you're facing, and that this experience is good for me because it's making me strong. Do we really need it? Do we really need this experience to make us strong? No, we don't. But, you know, survival, right? So this is what covert racism looks like in reality, when you're facing it.
Yeah, and I think for a long time in my career, I thought what was important was surviving. But, you know, I've kind of gotten to a point where I think, well, listen, I deserve to thrive. I don't want to just survive. I work hard. I give all I've got. And for that, I want to be a thriver, not a survivor, you know, and actually to constantly allow myself to be put into a mode where all I do is about surviving is just, it's not okay for me. I need more. I want more. I deserve more. And I think we all deserve more. And so, and for those, you know, we've just talked about allies. I think one of the key challenges for allies is that you look at the people of color with all that beautiful intersectionality mixed in with that, and you help people thrive, not just survive.
I love that, Jennifer. Thrive, not survive. That's the mantra. That's it. If nothing else from this call, we need to thrive, not survive. That's it. You know, talking about allyship, that has been mentioned a few times on the call, and we've had a few comments from the audience as well. Sandra, what has been your most vivid experience with allyship? Would love to hear the stories that have stuck with you and you carry with you to this day because they have been so profound.
Yeah, in terms of me, someone being an ally for me, or I just want to be clear on your question.
I think that's what it means. Your most vivid experience of allyship.
Sure. Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I recently made a comment on LinkedIn about how in my early days in my career, how I experienced so many microaggressions and really racist behaviors towards me. And as a young woman of color, just didn't really know how to navigate through all of that. And when I look back, you know, wish that I was more intentional about identifying people who could mentor me and who could also be an ally and a sponsor for me. And how I feel like I missed out on that. But as time has gone on, and obviously I've been much more intentional and strategic about that. And I've had a number of instances throughout my latter career where I've had other folks step up to the plate and not just be allies, but also be sponsors. And I talk about the distinction between those two because I think they're both They both are very valued, but they're different and are necessary. But I even think about my colleague, David Livermore. We have so many rich conversations. I always, I tell him he's really my brother from another mother, right? But we have so many rich conversations. And I know he's always conscious of and intentional about ways in which he can be an ally for me, in the work that we do, and it can be something as simple as, here I am, a Black woman executive with a doctorate degree, and Dave and I can be someplace speaking, and I can say something, right? And he can come behind me and say the exact same thing, and all of a sudden it has a whole nother level of credibility, right? We recognize that. And so those powerful conversations that we can have together. And so when we're out in those spaces, he does a phenomenal job of making sure that he's challenging when those experiences attempt to creep into. So that's one really powerful example. And then just the sponsorship piece, right? And the difference that I make there is an ally is one that comes alongside and supports and they speak out, but the sponsor is one who is very intentional about helping you get to where you want to be, right? So thriving, right? If I'm in an organization and I really want to move up the leadership ladder, that sponsor, I want to thrive in that organization. That sponsor is going to literally pave the way and use their influence to help me get to where I need to get. And I've had those positive experiences as well. But the one that stands out the most are the many times when Dr. Livermore and I have been working together over the many years, and I've seen him step up on numerous occasions to be an ally and a sponsor for me.
Allyship at its best, absolutely. That's where, that's where it counts, right? Standing up. But equally, when do we speak up and when do we not? It's understanding that as much as speaking up. Is there, we've got a couple of minutes, Jennifer. Do you have any examples of great allyship that you've experienced?
Ratika, I was just going to say very quickly, you're exactly right in terms of that balance. So I always remind Dave, we talk about the importance of not white-splaining or mansplaining, right? So that's another piece.
Yeah. And without this, turning this into a kind of, Dr. Livermore fan club webinar, I would have to say exactly the same. I met him when he did I did my cultural intelligence certification, and I remember just being so passionate, jumping around, just wanting to do something with this. And from when I set up Above Difference as a single person, doing what I was doing in a very little scale, and to what we're doing now, we're one of the fastest growing organization. We've got a team of people working across a lot of huge public sector organizations. The support, the willingness to flex, to provide those opportunities so I could grow Above Difference, that for me has been, in many ways, a mixture of the two. There's a very clear distinction, but a mixture of the two. And I think the other person I would also count is I talked earlier about Avon and Somerset and Chief Constable Andy Marsh, and I was this Black woman coming to him saying, I've got this concept, it's going to make a huge difference, take a chance on me, literally. And he did. And I mean, that has yielded great results. But he's another person who I think has, ever since I met him, has walked the walk and talked the talk. And and I think, like Sandra, there are quite a few people along the journey who I can think of have been either a mixture of those two things or one of those two things. And that makes the journey so much more interesting, because focusing on those people and what they bring or what they've brought into your life sometimes means that you can shift your focus away from the bad memories and the ones who have been so far down the opposite end of the scale.
Yes, right. Dave Livermore fan club, right? I've only been here for 3 months, but I said in a recent conversation, I said to Dave, you are the personification of CQ. Yeah. And if the rest of the world can become like you, then what a great world we'd be living in. And I meant that from the bottom of my heart, because, the respect that comes, the understanding that comes from having that such high CQ is, you see that in your daily interactions with somebody, and how that motivates you, how that, mentors you, how that supports you, and how that empowers you and makes you who you are. It's phenomenal. So talking about Dave Livermore, anyone dialing in from London, he's actually going to be here the last week of October. So if you want to see him and hear him in action, please sign up. It's the 26th of October in Covent Garden. And our links, it's on our website, it's on our LinkedIn profile. So would love to see some of you there. But on that note, we've also run out of time. I mean, we could go on, couldn't we? This is such a great, powerful conversation. And I just want to thank you and the audience. It's great, great conversation in the audience. Everyone speaking from their heart in obviously what they thought was a safe space. So thank you for that. Thank you to the audience. And thank you so much, Dr. Upton and Jennifer. It's just been, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I've learned so much from listening to both of you. And yeah, thank you for being there.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.